Hello again, everyone. So we're going to be reading chapter 21 of The Boy at the Back of the Class. The Neighbours and the News. Sometimes grown-ups can be so confusing that they make you scratch your head. When Officer Martina took me home, Mum was the angriest I'd ever seen her before. At first it was scary because she kept shouting things like, "I can't believe you did this," and "What if something had happened to you?" But then she would hug me and hold me so tight that I thought my bones were going to be crushed. I wasn't quite sure if I was being told off or not. When she had calmed down, Mum made me hot soup and told me to tell her everything. So I told her about Amit's pictures and about what the man and woman on the bus had said about the dates, and the greatest idea in the world, and the emergency plan, and everything that had happened in front of the Queen's palace. Mum was quiet whilst I talked, and then, after I'd finished telling her everything, she sat still for a long time and didn't say anything at all. I was too scared to say anything else, so I sat my hands and stared at the table. Finally, Mum opened her mouth to say something, but the doorbell rang. "Who's that, I wonder?" Mum said. When she opened the door, Mrs. Gillingham, the neighbour who lived next door to Mrs. Abbey, was standing outside. She always wears lots of necklaces and bright pink nail varnish and long, dangly earrings. I like her because she smells like puff pastry, and at Christmas she always gives me a stocking filled with sweets. "Oh, hiya, love," cried out Mrs. Gillingham. She gave me a hug. "Thank goodness you're back safe and sound. But my, that was brave of you, wasn't it? The woman on the news said it was so you could help the refugees." Sorry, Mrs. Gillingham," said Mum, frowning. "Did you just say you heard about it on the news?" "Oh, it's all over the telly, all over it," said Mrs. Gillingham excitedly. "I expect you'll hear from the reporters soon." "Well, yes, thank you for letting us know, Mrs. Gillingham." Mum started to close the door. "We'd better get some rest. It's been a long day." Mum started to close the door. "We'd better get some rest. It's been a long day." She waved Mrs. Gillingham out the door and then looked down at me. The news." Just then, the doorbell rang again. "Who is it?" called out Mum. "It's Mr. Rasheed," came a man's voice. There was a loud "ouch" before he added, "And Mrs. Rasheed." Mum looked at me in surprise and opened the door again. This time, exactly where Mrs. Gillingham had been standing, were Mr. and Mrs. Rasheed. They lived one floor below us and have twins. You can tell when they're home because they always leave the pushchair in the landing. It's too big to fit through their front door. We usually only ever see them in the lift or when they need help getting their pushchair out of the main door. But I like them. Especially Mrs. Rasheed because she wears the brightest colours. Once she wore a long, flowing dress that had millions of tiny sequins on it and made her shine like a goldfish. She's always smiling and laughing with the babies, and Mr. Rasheed likes to shout out the cricket scores to anyone he can find. But this was the first time they had ever come to our flat. "Hello," said Mum. Mrs. Rasheed held up her phone. "We've just read all about it," she cried, shoving it into Mum's hand and pointing to a news story with a picture of lots of palace guards standing around someone lying on the floor. "You're so brave. Now the Queen herself can't ignore what's happening to those families. I haven't slept for months thinking about it. Months. It makes me so angry. All those poor people with their little babies just trying to live. We send baby clothes and shoes whenever we can, but we don't have much money to spare," continued Mr. Rasheed. "We send baby clothes and shoes whenever we can, but we haven't much money to spare," continued Mr. Rasheed, his voice suddenly heavy and wobbly. "And now," Mrs. Rasheed spotted me over Mum's shoulder and bent down. "Oh, you darling, please, let me hug you." I hesitated for a moment. I don't always like being hugged, but Mrs. Rasheed seemed nice. So, I slowly walked over to her and let her hug me, and then hugged her back. "If your refugee friend needs any at all, please tell us," she said, touching my cheeks. "Yes?" "Promise," said Promise?" said Mr. Rasheed, his eyes big and serious. I nodded, because I knew Ahmet would probably like Mr. and Mrs. Rasheed, and wouldn't mind me asking them for help for him. "Good. Now, you take care," grinned Mr. Rasheed, as he and Mrs. Rasheed turned away and headed down the stairs. "Well, this is turning into quite a day, isn't it?" laughed my mum, looking down at me and giving my shoulders a squeeze. But before she could close the door, Mr. Greigs' huge head suddenly popped in. I took a step back and hid behind my mum, because I don't like Mr. Greigs at all, even though he always dresses in a suit and takes his hat off whenever he sees anyone he likes. I can tell Mum doesn't like him either, because she never says hello to him when we see him, and my mum always says hello to everyone. Even the man who sleeps in the doorway of Mr. Pelesti's shop on the corner of our road. "Yes, Mr. Greigs, what can I do for you?" asked Mum in her most polite voice. She only ever uses that voice when she talks to people she doesn't like Aunt Christina or the man with the clipboard who calls himself landlord. Mr. Greigs cleared his throat and said, "I've just dropped by to say that your daughter there would do well to mind her own business. Those pesky refugees are only here because they want a piece of our benefits pie. She ought to know better, and you ought to have taught her better." I looked up at Mum's face and saw that it had gone as white as one of our dinner plates as she stared at Mr. Greigs without blinking. "Have you finished?" she said in a voice that was so cold I didn't recognize it. "All I'm saying is that your child was nearly killed today for immigrant pests that want the easy life without having to work a day for it. I mean, I know you're not exactly white, but you've been here long enough to know better, surely." "Mr. Greigs, that is quite enough," said Mum, her voice cold and formal. Her eyes had narrowed, and her hands had become tight little balls. "You and your views are not welcome here. Please leave." And taking a step back, Mum slammed the door just as loudly as she could, so that one second Mr. Greigs was there, and the next second he wasn't. We could hear him ranting at us from the other side, but after a few seconds his voice started to get fainter and fainter. "Despicable man," muttered Mum, clicking the extra bolt on the door shut, "with his dinner jackets and silly neckerchiefs trying to cover up his bigotry." "Why is he so angry, Mum?" I asked, slipping my hand into hers. "And why did he call refugees pests?" "Because he's a heartless, selfish man who hates everyone far too much to want to help anyone," said Mum. "Even refugee children like Ahmet." "Oh," I said, wondering how anyone could hate someone who was running away from bullies and bombs. Mr. Greigs had clearly never met someone like Ahmet before, because if he had, he could never have been so horrible about anyone who had to become a refugee. "Now, let's forget about Mr. Greigs and go and see what the news is saying about you, shall we?" She ruffled my hair and then went and switched on the telly as I did a running jump onto the sofa. After a few seconds, a newsreader flashed up onto the screen. Her voice was warm as she said, "Today, an incident at Buckingham Palace added a few extra steps to the changing of the guard ceremony, as a 9-year-old child ran out and intercepted one of the Queen's Coldstream Guards. As she talked, the picture changed, and I appeared on their screens. As she talked, the picture changed, and I appeared on the screen, running out of the crowd and reaching up to touch a palace guard's arm, with Tom just a few steps behind me. I looked so scared that it made me wonder how I'd done what I did. I'd never, ever seen anyone I knew on television before, and it was the strangest thing in the world to not only see myself on it, but to have done something that a newsreader was talking about. It transpired that the child in question wanted to hand in a note for the Queen, appealing for help on behalf of a refugee boy searching for his parents, following their joint escape from the ongoing conflict in Syria. We're expecting an official response from Buckingham Palace later this evening. Mum quickly flipped over to the next channel. Another newsreader was talking, and behind him was another picture of me, looking shocked and scared. Queen's Guard had an unexpected encounter today, as a young child broke through the barriers during the famed changing of the guard ceremony. It is said that the attack was made in protest against the government's poor handling of refugee crisis. But I didn't attack anyone, I cried out. Mum nodded but didn't say anything, and instead switched the channel to another newsreader. The third newsreader confused me the most, because he said, a 9-year-old child sparked a terrorist alert today after disturbing the changing of the guard ceremony and raising wider questions around security. Mum leaned over and turned off the sound. But I didn't want to hurt anyone, I said, trying not to cry. Why do they think I'm a terrorist? Mum sighed sadly, and opening her arms, pulled me towards her. There are lots of silly people in the world, darling. People who are so afraid of anyone who doesn't look like them, or dress like them, or eat the same food as them, that they call other people, even children like you, all sorts of silly names. But I eat everything, I said, confused, except broccoli and baked beans. And what's wrong with what I wear? Nothing at all, said Mum. But they might still be scared of you because you don't look like them, she said, stroking my hand. So, I'm scary? Just because I look different, I asked. Mum nodded. Yes, silly, isn't it? I leaned back against my mum and fell into a deep thought. That's when your brain falls down into a giant hole in the middle of your mind and has to try and put all the pieces of a thought together so that it makes sense. And because your brain is working so hard, you can't think or talk about or see anything else. All you can really do is think about the deep thought. The deep thought my brain had found was wondering how anyone could be scared of me just because I didn't look like them. Everyone in school looks different and likes different things, and has parents who come from all kinds of different places. Tom's mum and dad come from different places in America, one called Florida and the other called California. Michael's mum comes from a place called Nigeria, and his dad comes from France, which is why he always goes on lots of holidays and has even seen a giraffe and an elephant in the forest. Josie's mum comes from Barking, and her dad comes from Bradford, which is why they speak differently. And her dad always sounds like he's asking a question, even when he isn't. And Mum and Uncle Lenny were both born in a faraway place I've never been to, called Indonesia, and my dad was born in Austria. Mrs. Abbey once said that I was lucky to have parents from different places, because it meant I never needed to go on holiday to get a suntan. I like looking like I have a suntan, and I like everyone being different. It would be too boring if everyone was exactly the same as each other. Mum, I asked, because the deep thought had started to give me a headache, does that mean the Queen's Special Guards were scared of me too? Mum looked at me and asked, did they seem scared of you? No, I said, after thinking hard. They were nice. Well then, she replied, stroking my hair, the thing you have to remember is that for every silly person who's afraid of you, there are at least 20 people who aren't silly at all. Okay, I said, feeling better. It was good to know that there were more nice people in the world than there were silly people in it. Just then, a face I knew popped onto the television screen. Mum, look, it's the taxi man, I shouted excitedly. He took us from the station to the Queen's Palace, and he wouldn't take our money. Mum put the sound up and we both listened as a big red sign with Stan O'Connell, taxi driver, popped up underneath the picture of his smiling face. They were just kids, he said, he was saying cheerfully. Innocent kids, you know. A man next to him, who must have been the reporter because he was holding a microphone, said, "And you didn't get the impression that they were planning any sort of terrorist attack?" Mum made an angry sound in her throat, and I saw her shake her head. But Stan the taxi man smiled again and said, "I didn't get that impression because that wasn't what happened. You can ask me another 5 times, though, if you like." That made Mum burst out laughing, and she said she was glad I'd met a cabbie who was good and as funny as my Uncle Lenny was. Just then, the phone started to ring, and it was my Uncle Lenny checking to make sure I was okay. And after he rang, lots of other people rang too, but they weren't people we knew. They were reporters from newspapers. In the end, Mum turned the phone off and said it was time to put this adventure to bed, because tomorrow would bring with it a brand new adventure to go on. Mum let me go to bed a whole 30 minutes late that night, because I wanted to watch the news again. Lots of people had taken pictures and videos of me running onto the road. It was strange seeing things that I hadn't been able to see for myself at the time, even though I'd been there and it had all happened to me. I hadn't realised how exciting it had been. As soon as I ran out onto the road, the police had started shouting and moving the crowd back and surrounded me in a big circle, and all the special guards had stopped playing their drums and trumpets and slammed the palace doors shut. It felt as if I was watching a movie starring someone that looked like me, but wasn't me at all. I lay in bed that night trying to make sense of everything that had happened, but my brain felt fuzzy and tired, so in the end I gave up and closed my eyes. None of it mattered, really. Anyway, what mattered was that we had given our note to the special guards, and they had given us their word that they would tell the Queen about Armit. And just as soon as they did, she would send out her special guards to find Armit's family before the gates closed shut. And it was too late. Okay, so that was chapter 21 of The Boy at the Back of the Class. And I will be reading chapter 22 next time.